Oh, oh. Hariom and greetings from Niagara Falls. By show of hands, how many of you know what a gigaton is? A gigaton. Yeah, very few of us. The first time I came across this word was Pearl Jam's 11th studio album. It's called gigaton. And it made me research, why is it called gigaton? A gigaton is 1 billion, that's with a B, metric tons. Like that's a number that you can't even conceive of. This measures carbon dioxide that keeps being radiated or spewed into our environment. Just imagine an amount we can't conceptualize is being put out into our world. And so this album was to draw people's attention to this is reality. This is what we are manifesting for all of us as seekers. A quality of a seeker is sensitivity, a sensitivity to what are my actions doing to the next person? What are my words doing to the person over there? What are my thoughts doing for the world? A seeker is one who is sensitive, and vice versa. It is for this reason that we have a loving earth sangha. I may be sensitive to the earth, but maybe the people around me are not. What if I can synergize with that person and that person and that person? Through this synergy, I will feel better. I will feel stronger. I can love our earth back more strong. In our Loving Earth Sangha in 2025, we are really trying to see how our maps of evolution, like Rishi Patanjali's Yoga Sutras, how this can guide us to loving the earth. And so we are taking up what Rishi Patanjali has taught as the yamas, that is the don'ts, and the niyamas, that is the do's. In the yamas, there are 5 yamas, 5 niyamas. The last of the yamas is Satya. Can you share with me in the chat what Satya means to you? What does Satya mean to you? It's my aunt's name. That's who Satya is. Satya, you're going to write as truth. See, I could just read your minds. How do you practice the truth? It is difficult for us to practice the truth because it's too absolute or too abstract. And so, Satya, in a practicable way, is non compromising. Non compromising. Now, I'll give you a system on how this plays out. Our journey to joy, and I know you can all resonate with this, has begun with satsanga. Agreed? Sat hyphen sangha. My company, my association, my exposure to this environment of inclusivity. Do you all feel included here? This is an environment of inclusivity. Nobody here cares what your income is or what your degree is. We care about each other. Satsanga then propels one to Satya. Satya, I've defined as non compromising, but it also means ideally. Ideally, it is to live based on a ideal or ideals. What's an ideal? Not to sleep in. What's an ideal? Not to use curse words. What's an ideal? To be detached. Ideally. The next in this sequence is sattva. Sat, sangha. Sat, ya. Sattva. In English, this would be integrity. I have an ideal, and I'm going to implement the integrity to follow through with this. So you see how Satya and Sattva, when these are combined, there's a non-compromising that's involved. And now the final part of this journey to joy is Sat. Sat means existence. Sat means infinitude. So non-compromising when it comes to living in and for our earth. In and for our earth. With changes in governments, a change that has happened in Canada is many of the major banks, they were not bankrolling, they were not supporting those industries or those causes which were harmful to the environment. But with changes in governments, now those banks have signed off on that, as in they're not following through. They have begun to resume funding these industries and causes. To me, that is a strong sign of compromise. This is the ideal, but that integrity is not there, so compromise happened. Now, bringing this to a micro level, when it comes to the resources you have, I have, we have, is our generation and utilization of resources also environmentally sensitive? Is it also an expression of loving our earth? And so that's what we're going to learn about today. And our team and our seeker will continue.
Hariom, everyone. Before we begin today's presentation, we wanted to first take some time to talk about our lifestyle tracker. So I'll just go ahead and I'll share my screen right now. Give me one moment. Okay. Can you confirm that you can see my screen?
Yes.
Great. Perfect. Okay. So for those of you who aren't familiar or need a refresher, each month we ask that seekers set themselves a goal related to the sustainability topic covered in that month's workshop and then track their progress throughout the month. And we launched our lifestyle tracker at the beginning of the year because it's really important that our community doesn't just learn about sustainable practices, but that we practice them too if we really want to make a difference. And just as it's not simply enough to learn about the yamas and the niyamas, we have to actually apply these teachings if we want to develop and improve ourselves, right? So that's how the tracker came to be. And the tracker is a twofold measure. So yes, it's a way to create accountability, but it's also meant to inspire. So you can see on the tracker who set what goals, and you can reach out to these individuals and learn about their progress, what worked and what didn't work, share ideas. So it's a great way to foster collaboration and connections as well. But it's not effective if we're not using it. So we have noticed that there's been a decrease in how many people were setting goals and an increase in how many people were setting goals, but then not starting them and following through. And, you know, we absolutely understand that everyone's lives are busy. You know, everyone has different commitments, things fall through the cracks. But this is just a gentle reminder that any type of change starts at the individual level. You really have to be the change that you want to see in the world in order to create momentum and movement in our broader communities and society. So we hope that you take this to heart and try to fill this tracker out on a monthly basis and make every effort to reach it too. And you know, neither this announcement nor this tracker is meant to shame whatsoever. We don't care whether you accomplish your goal or not. I mean, well, we do. We would like that you accomplish them, but what's more important is that you make that commitment and then you make that concerted effort. And it doesn't have to be a grand or lofty goal. If anything, it's better to start with something small and achievable. So we just wanted you to have this in your mind as we move through the workshop today. And perhaps you can listen to our speaker with a lens of, how can I create a goal around what I'm learning today? So thank you for indulging this little aside. And again, at the end of today's workshop, we will share the link to the spreadsheet so that you can set your goal for May. So over to you, Aditya.
Okay, Hariom, everyone. Thank you all for joining. I'm very excited actually to introduce our speaker today. It is Shantakumar Varneetjalam, and he is actually not joining us from the States, but from Singapore. And he works on topics related to sustainable investing and works to try and develop solutions that can serve the earth by leveraging finance. And just before this call, I looked him up on LinkedIn, and I was kind of amazed at kind of the eclectic career he's had. Uh, he has started his career in the army, then became a lawyer, and then a banker, and did his MBA, and now works on impact investing. And so I'm very excited to learn from Shantakumar about how we can put our funds and money to good use, and how we can invest in a manner that creates positive impact. Over to you, Sean. Looking forward to learning from you.
Hariom Aditya, Hariom everyone, and Hariom Vivekji. Thank you all for this opportunity and very grateful to have the chance to share. One thing that might be some useful context on, if just to stitch the threads of that background together, to me, the North Star behind all of this, has always been the idea of the RINs we have, the debts. And one key one is actually to our environment. And something that I remember Swami Sarupananji talking about during our Upanayana ceremony that kind of hit home, right? And I think from the military through to this, it's been a quest of how do we serve people on the planet through work. And that's why, for me, when I look at the challenges before us today, one of the most significant ones I think of our era is really, yes, thank you, Vivekji. In my mind, one of the most significant ones that's going to impact so many aspects of our lives is going to be climate, which is why this issue. So I want to start today's discussion in framing some of that challenge and what we've seen. The short answer today is we are headed for a world in which, as we exceed 2024, we actually exceeded the 1.5-degree threshold above pre-industrial levels. The significance of this is that 1.5-degree rise leads to a series of what are called a number of tipping points, whether it's glaciers melting, et cetera, that actually accelerate the rate of climate change, because this is not linear, being a natural system, it's exponential. And blowing past some of these points all of a sudden shifts us on an entirely different trajectory. The point of all of this, and this is going to have knock-on effects, right? When we look at the wildfires, unfortunately, Canada suffered. You look at what happened in LA, you look at hurricane strengths over Florida. All of this are direct consequences of what we're seeing before us, which is why, to me, I think this is such an urgent challenge we need to deal with. At the same time, you look at climatic issues, when you look at the current potential conflict between India and Pakistan, a major issue there's actually over water as well, right? Which is why this Indus Water Treaty is so important, where once again, the impact that could have on driving future conflict over water is something that Pentagon identified in a 2010 defense paper, which I remember reading when I was still in the military, all of which is driving part of this challenge. So with that broad background context and why this is such an urgent and imminent challenge, I'll come to, I think, what I think we can do about it and why I think finance is a potential lever. So when we look forward to where we are today, there are several ways in which we can act on this. The biggest challenge we've seen is actually the funding gap today for sustainable finance, where the estimates are between $3 to $5 trillion a year is the gap between where we stand now and what we need to fund to actually bend this arc on climate to a meaningful trajectory that's more in line with not even 1.5 to get to 2 degrees Celsius in where we stand. So it'll still lead to some adverse impacts, but potentially much less than what could happen down the line. And so when we think about that, what are these possible sources and what role do we have as individuals acting in all of this? So sustainable finance, I think, has become a more imminent theme in the mid-2000, I think it was around 2007-8, it really started to pick up. And it was really in 2016 onwards that in mainstream finance, this has really accelerated as a key pull. But there was one interesting point I've always wanted to emphasize in this industry. I was the co-chair of I worked at an investment bank before, as Satya mentioned. and I was co-chair of our Deepavali committee. And I remember when we had the event, I said to everyone, we had a dance drama by some of the chicks there on the churning of the ocean. And it was quite nice where they juxtaposed the environmental pollution in the churning, and they were showing all these things and people coughing, etc. And I said, look, sustainable finance has become this thing on Wall Street in the last 10 years. The reality is, for millennia, we in our tradition have always worshipped Mother Lakshmi and Vishnu Bhagavan, right? Because you can't have wealth without sustainability, and vice versa, because it's non-durable. And I hit home to a bunch of these, very American Wall Street bankers, where I said, this is why this is so key. And in our culture, we've seen this for millennia. And I think that's why it's so important. And so with that, right, there's also, as Vivekji pointed out, there's a whole political seesaw around this, where we've seen some people just ride the political wave and jump on the bandwagon. And of course, as soon as the impetus went, people have jumped off. And so how do we then start to take action around this? We've seen actually Canada play a key leading role. So one of the Canadian pension funds, CDPQ, out of Montreal, actually does something very interesting where they start to actually tie the compensation of investment teams to climate goals. So if they achieve a strong investment return, but they don't hit their climate goal, they don't get their performance bonus as part of it. And I think the message to take away from that example is that incentives drive behavior. So what is it that we can enact on within this? And I'm going to look at this from several dimensions. I think we as individual investors, in whatever capacity, whether it's through retail accounts, etc., have a role to play in that. We as members of pension schemes have a chance to sort of write and make our voices heard. And then we, of course, as individuals working within organizations can change this. And finally, the fourth bucket, I'll say, is as consumers, how this actually drives investing behavior on the other side. So let me touch on those points sequentially. The first thing I want to talk about on this is how do we start to change these things? I think what we're seeing is increasingly a receptiveness of banks as other institutions to some of this. And so one thing I think we need to start thinking about is where there are alternatives. And I can't say I'm fully aware of the Canadian landscape, but I know in the US, Australia, and Singapore, there are banking alternatives where you can actively switch to sort of green savings accounts and other options, shift away from that. And the inverse of that, and not the inverse, the complement of that, I'd say, sustainable portfolios, where there are increasingly sustainable investing strategies being offered, where actively shifting your allocations out of this becomes relevant. But then to the whole team of Satya, what then comes up is this point on, are these funds truly maintaining integrity? And what I want to shed some light on is what are the things to look out for to see if there is Satya and integrity there, or if it's a greenwash, which is a major concern today. What are some of these examples of greenwashing? We've seen some major funds which have what are called ETFs and exchange-traded funds and others have these green options, which still hold a whole number of energy companies who might be very high fossil fuel emitters. So they're saying they're sustainable. When you look at the underlying portfolio, this is not the case. So the first key part, and this may sound slightly obvious, is to look at what is the underlying composition of the portfolio within that. And so when you look at that composition, so look at what are those companies. And I think in this era of AI, it's easy enough to spit that into something and then to identify, which of these companies are potentially at risk of greenwashing by saying, what are their emissions profiles? What are their uses of energy? And are they generating a lot of these? And some of these will be relatively obvious, right? Like you had a number of these funds that got called out because they had Chevron, number of large energy companies in their sustainable portfolios. So that to me is the first step. Digging a level below that, it's worthwhile thinking if there's active engagement with teams. And this is sometimes laid down in the strategy. So you actually have some activist funds that go out and actively try to make these businesses more sustainable. So there's actually an interesting one, I think, called Arjuna Capital that's been active in the space out of New York, run by a number of folks. And they have this idea of trying to uphold environment, although it's a bunch of Americans who I think have done incredibly well in trying to steam that together. We saw another one that did have some early success, but then it's petered out, a group called Engine Number One that was able to lead an activist campaign that actually changed part of the board of ExxonMobil to focus on climate, but they then haven't maintained that strategy subsequently because they, I think, also flipped away from this approach. But initially had an incredible job in shifting, what was effectively a very large ship, being able to get behind the wheel and start to turn that towards this. So these are some things to look out for when you think about how we allocate our individual assets. The next piece I'd like to talk about is what we can do then and how our consumption behavior changes investing behavior. So one very interesting thing we've seen, one of the groups we collaborate closely with is an entity called the World Business Council for Sustainable Development. It's a collective of 252 companies who collectively represent 26% of global greenhouse gas emissions. So that's more than the whole of China combined. And so we've been working with them to think about how you can invest into their supply chain to decarbonize a lot of their businesses, particularly looking at options in Bharat, where increasingly with the current geopolitical tension, we're going to see a shift in the manufacturing base, which I'll come to next as a secular theme. But what's been interesting about that, talking with the CEOs and senior execs in these companies, thinking the likes of Unilever, Danone, Procter and Gamble, these large consumer goods companies, these shifts in consumer behavior are actively driving their investing and product decisions. And consequently, this on the investing side is driving earnings for these companies and constantly driving the investment behavior of how capital is allocated to these entities along the way. So I bring that up because as consumers, I think it sometimes be overlooked the role we have in shaping the behavior of these kinds of institutions. And I just wanted to lay out that chain of events within this. The next element I wanted to touch on, given I see we also have a number of, we have a whole age range here. I think professionally, we're at an interesting time where increasingly there are opportunities across the sustainable sector. Admittedly, it's taken a bit of a headwind in the United States at the moment, in the current political environment. But what we are seeing more broadly globally is a concerted push towards this. And the challenge on this has to be that we have to do it, yes, because it's a good thing to do for the environment, but we have to work hard to cut to the core of opportunities to make sure it makes economic sense as well. And there are increasingly opportunities like this we're seeing that do it. And so what do I mean by this? I think there are increasingly job opportunities across, whether it's on the investing side, on the investment banking side, on the consulting side to go advise companies on how to do this, as well as working within companies on strategy, etc., to actually help them go on this path. And all of this founded, I think, on solutions that are being driven by technological breakthroughs to ultimately make the green solution have what's called a green discount, where it's cheaper than your fossil fuel or high carbon alternative. And I think that green discount has to be critical in it. Where I think we lost a bit of our path over the last few years is we had what were called many green premiums, which you need to absorb initially, where the green option is more expensive than what you have with your fossil fuel option, which then makes it harder to drive adoption. Now, the argument is sometimes as you scale a company, then costs come down, you can hit that point. And of course, that makes sense. But I think we saw a lot of companies fail to hold that integrity, in some ways, talking about Satya, to sort of what that core is, washing over the fact that this thing did not make economic sense and ultimately distract a lot of investors and led to uneconomic solutions happening, a bunch of which are now crashing and burning in the current environment where you've got a potential looming recession, higher interest rates, all of which are making it challenging to continue funding loss-making solutions. But there are those options directly available. And then the final piece I wanted to touch on within this whole angle is actually the role I think that Bharat plays in this entire piece. The current geopolitical environment has been a very, very interesting one. So for context, I work now with a leading investment group that invests into India as well as globally. But part of that thesis of me joining them was because of, I think, the transition we're going to see in Bharat with this entire transition, right? Where I'll give you one simple example. Apple has gone from making 14% of its global iPhones to now with the current tariff environment, actually now asking the Indian suppliers to manufacture 100% of iPhones exported to the United States from Bharat. And I think that is representative of this broader manufacturing shift we're seeing. And with that manufacturing shift, we see a substantial opportunity in the actual industrial decarbonization. Because do we have a chance to leapfrog and set Bharat on a path for sustainable industrial development without going the path we've seen in other parts of the world that's high pollutive and then you're trying to fix the problem after it started? Another very interesting statistic we've seen in our research on it, 80% of Bharat's current urban development is yet to be built. So when you think that we're at 20% of the build of where the country will be in 20 to 30 years, that's a tremendous opportunity to shift that. And so we're looking actively at sustainable building materials, cement which absorbs carbon, and other solutions, and even the transport and logistics side, looking to reshape logistics to ultimately transform last mile delivery for companies. So one example of this is we own a company that's one of the largest battery charging and swapping businesses. We are cheaper upfront than diesel and petrol vehicles in Bharat. And we are cheaper to run per kilometer as well. So we, for example, work with Amazon, with Walmart, with some large Indian groups like Swiggy and Zomato to do last mile delivery with battery charging and swapping. But all of those solutions are cheaper, both upfront and to run. And so it's no longer a nature-based argument, it's an economic argument to actually drive that sustainable transition. We're now looking at a similar play to help decarbonize buses and trucks across Bharat through targeting key corridors between major cities that we can focus on for this. When you think about, the heavy diesel buses that you typically see on those routes. So these have been some of the areas we've been looking at. The final emerging theme I wanted to touch on is the role of AI. I think AI in one ways is going to cook the planet if we don't get it right and don't decarbonize data centers in the way we're using this. But the other thing we're working on actively is actually AI as a source of solutions for this. And so when we say AI as a source of solutions, we're looking across a number of fields. How we generate power, and can we generate more renewables through better weather modeling and things like that? How do we manage transmission and distribution through better using the existing grid infrastructure, using AI better manage the flow of electrons? And then thirdly, through demand, and this is a role where we can all play, where we're actively seeing solutions now, where you can, actually one of them is interestingly a Canadian company that's globally active called AmpX. And what they're doing, they're actually working with homeowners to do a deal with them where they say, you let us manage your power at home. You tell us when you want to leave the house with your electric car, how much power you want to have in your electric battery. And we will then manage your power to turn things off and on as and when, and we'll share with you part of those savings, you realize. So instead of the way power works, you typically have a series of what are called load centers, which is typically our homes, businesses, factories, and so on. And you have generation centers, which could be solar farms, it could be wind farms, it could be gas stations, it could be coal-fired power plants. And so what the whole game is about is how do you manage these two? And one solution is to just keep building generating capacity and storage capacity in terms of batteries. The other way is to manage the demand. So by doing this, what they're trying to do is avoid firing up gas stations because it's cheaper to get you to, use less of your power, draw on your home-based battery than it is to fire up a gas-fired power plant. So these are some of the interesting innovations we're seeing. And they're using AI to manage a lot of that. So that's one piece. The other pieces we're seeing in the space are AI for material science, where we can better discover battery chemistries to exponentially reduce the cost of batteries and increase their power density. Because the biggest challenge today in our energy transition is actually on how do we better manage the volatility or what's called the intermittency of the power system, right? Where the sun shines, the wind blows, but it doesn't do it constantly at the same rate. So all of these are some ways we're seeing on the material science and these. And the final piece is on coordinations of materials and logistics, where we're seeing it being used to manage the flow of goods, to also manage supply chains, to make groups more sustainable in their factories. So all of these, some of the levers we're seeing on climate today now, sort of investing opportunities. So those were the sort of prepared remarks I had for sharing. What I now wanted to do is I want to check, we have 33 participants. I think it probably makes sense to maybe have 2 breakout groups, Aditya, if you think. I think 15 each, or we can make it 3 if you prefer. 3. Okay, 3 sounds good. And I think there are 2 topics that'd be interesting to discuss. With the context of these different opportunities and actions, what are things we think is within grasp of whether it's the work we have today, whether it's the opportunities we're looking at, whether from a direct personal investing or saving perspective, or which we can affect through our connections with companies, other entities. What are some of these things we can change based on what I've just shared? And how could we possibly do that? I thought 2 useful points to discuss following off this. So with that, I'll let Aditya, if you and the team want to coordinate how we best split people up, bring them back in.